Good evening and welcome to Objective 5. We tonight will look at the European countries as they set out for exploration when they want to try to cross the Atlantic, potentially find a shorter route to the Indies and to their key trading partners. The map here you'll see is the Iberian Peninsula, and the Iberian Peninsula refers to the countries of Spain and Portugal, and as you can see, it's somewhat awkward, but surrounded by water on three sides. And so it's the Iberian Peninsula countries, Spain and Portugal, that kick off and are the first to go on exploration tours.
Okay, let's talk about some famous explorers of the era, as my fifth grade teacher would love to discuss the Vasco da Gamas and the Christopher Columbuses and the Ferdinand Magellans. So you should have enough information from your own brain in the textbook in order to fill in some notes on these three individuals. So feel free to pause and do that now. Let's talk about Vasco da Gama, this handsome gentleman on the right side. So he sails on behalf of Portugal, and he's the first of the European navigators to reach India. He travels south, just underneath the Cape of Good Hope in Africa, in order to reach India. Meanwhile, Christopher Columbus, yep, that guy right there, while Italian, he sails for Ferdinand and Isabel, the King and Queen of Spain, and discovers the West Indies. That is, he tries to also get to the Indies or India to find some spices, and he goes straight west and ends up in the Bahamas and Cuba and Hispaniola, where he discovers the Arawak and Taino people, who are maybe less than pleased to meet him, and the Cano people of Cuba. Fun side note. Hi, Lorena. Okay, let's keep going. Ferdinand Magellan. Keyword here is circumnavigation. He travels all the way around the globe, circum as in circle. The sphere of the globe is what Ferdinand Magellan was able to travel around. By way of the Atlantic Ocean, he arrives at the Pacific, and in fact, he is the person who names it because he finds the seas of the Pacific much more placid than the Atlantic, more peaceful or more Pacific. Think paz in Spanish.
All right, another quick check to go over the questions that you should be able to answer from your readings. First, how were countries like Britain and France able to gain the lead in exploration from Spain and Portugal? So like we mentioned, it is the countries of the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal, who kick off exploration and are the first to reach the Americas and claim land in Latin America. However, Britain and France take a different approach. So while Spain and Portugal are funded by their governments, so for example, Isabel and Ferdinand fund Columbus's journey to the Americas, Britain and France decide that their exploration should be in the hands of their merchants. And we'll go into this in more detail, but Britain has this thing called joint stock companies, where merchants band together to send trips to explore the Americas, regions of Asia, etc., with hopes of finding land that they can use for profit. And it's for this reason, among others, that Spain and Portugal slowly, their funds are depleted, the government funds, and Britain and France are able to surpass them. This is also aided by the superior navy or sea fleet, military fleet by sea, pardon me, of Britain. So what areas of the world did Britain and France explore and gain control of? Britain gains control of North America. Think about why we speak English in our classrooms. And the French go to modern-day Haiti and various islands in the Caribbean, as well as locations in Africa, and especially West Africa, and some of the northern more regions of North America. And those regions all speak French today. When you think about Brazil, speaks Portuguese because it was conquered by Portugal, and Latin America, or vast areas in Latin America, speak Spanish because they were conquered by Spain. So that's a quick tip for you when you're thinking about who conquered where. Think about the language that they speak. Question number 4, companies such as the Dutch East India Company and the British East India Company. This speaks to the government funding versus merchant funding ventures that I spoke about for question 2. These trading companies were extremely powerful. They were like pseudo governments because, again, the British, for example, and the Dutch governments both encouraged these companies to go and do exploration. And for that reason, these companies had their own military that they would use to conquer territory, and their goal was to gain monopolies in spheres of influence. So if they conquered a region, for example, the British East India Company in India, they become fiercely territorial of that area. They use their military to keep control of it. And the reason for that is that these companies want to be able to go back to Europe and sell their goods not just to their home country, but to the other countries in Europe. And this will become more and more relevant when we talk about mercantilism. But they become huge players, these companies, in our international trade.
So, as you can see, this is a world with mostly modern political divisions. We have, in a sense, the old world and the new, divided by the Atlantic Ocean between North and South America and Europe and Africa. You can see the Iberian Peninsula jutting out just above North Africa on the end of Europe. And then on the other side is the quote-unquote New World, North and South America. Fun fact, given Columbus's voyage to this New World and returning and his return to Spain, Portugal got a little jealous and was actually preparing to send their own fleet and potentially an army or navy, that is, to fight for new territory in the New World. And the Spanish got nervous, decided to entreaty the Pope, go talk to the Pope, who himself was Spanish, and said, well, hold up, we don't want to go to war here. And the Pope came up with something called the Treaty of Tordesillas, where a line of demarcation was drawn originally just on the edge of South America, the eastern edge of South America, that is right at the edge of Brazil, which wouldn't explain how Portugal ended up in Brazil, except that a year later, in, I believe, 1494, the line of demarcation was shifted just enough to the west so that Brazil could count as part of Portugal's territory. And that's why you see so much Spanish being spoken in Central and South America, and just a hint of Portuguese, primarily, of course, in Brazil. So take a moment to use page 353 in your textbook to fill in this map with which territories were discovered by the British, the French, the Portuguese, the Dutch, and the Spanish. Assuming you've paused, let's talk about who is exploring. Use your guided notes and answer the questions on the next page regarding the major European explorers. Go onto the map, follow the directions to identify major European countries involved in the exploration, and pause as needed. So now we're moving on to the next objective. Students will be able to describe elements of the New World economy, including the Columbian Exchange and the trade imbalance. So you can see here an image of that Columbian Exchange, raw materials like sugar, coffee, and cotton being sent from the Caribbean to the New World, to the Old World, to Europe. From Europe to Africa, manufactured goods that were produced from these raw materials. And let's not forget the enslavement of human beings in Africa in order to extract those raw materials that are then turned into manufactured goods traded in Africa, and the cycle continues and continues as represented by this Columbian Exchange. So, technology. How could people possibly sail thousands of miles across oceans without it? Well, first of all, better shipbuilding contributes to this ability of Europeans to make it across the ocean. We have lateen sails. Throughout much of maritime history, that is history of sailing, traveling by sea, you have square sails. And they're great if you just want the wind to take you places and you don't care that much for steering, let's say. But the lateen sail, the triangular sail, allows the ship captain to navigate the seas, and stronger ships allow for actual cross-ocean navigation, and their increased size also allow for greater cargo to be taken across. So we have better sails, which are actually first developed possibly in the Mediterranean or the Indian Ocean, and used by Arabs well before they were used by Europeans. But now this is the heyday of the lateen sail, when the European explorers head over to the New World. The compass is also improved, becomes more accurate. Map making is also far more accurate. The art of cartography becomes far more scientific as map makers develop longitude and latitude to allow them to travel. This is a map projection. The typical map projection, the Mercator map projection, allows you to get from point A to point B by ship very easily. And so ship captains would use this in order to help get from point to point. And let's not forget the takeover of the native populations or any others trying to get in the way. So the Chinese maybe developed the idea of explosives and guns, possibly taken from Indians who didn't even use it initially. But the Chinese develop it, and then the Europeans really use it to their advantage in the way of guns and other explosives. At the same time that this is happening, actually even a little bit before this, Chinese exploration, as you'll learn in a later lecture, is far more powerful than the Europeans, but very short-lived, and you'll get into that more soon. Zheng He is the name of the Chinese explorer who captained thousands of ships and was at the head of a very powerful Chinese navy and exploration force until eventually they decided to whatever the opposite of setting sail is, dropping sail, and pretty much end their maritime exploration. So Zheng He. Let's review. So who initially led the Europeans in exploration? As Miss Cassidy already referenced, this is the Iberian Peninsula countries of Portugal and Spain. And there's little Andorra. How cute. Why did they explore? What are their motivations? Well, let's not forget Jesus. We have J right here for Jesus. And get ready for it. There's another thing coming. Because they have missionary zeal for Christianity. They want to spread Christianity in the New World and gain converts. A for adventure. Let's go out and see the world. Young boys bored at home in their little villages could go set sail and be subjects in novels about their time at sea, discovering new places. So Jesus, adventure, wealth. Let's not forget about the desire for spices and gold and territory and everything that can make you money. And wait for it, S, the search for more land, for kings and queens, and even for the explorers individually. In other words, Jaws. Get it? Jesus, adventure, wealth, search, J-A-W-S. Jaws. And there's the shark, Jaws, ready to attack. Jaws, he's the Europeans, and that woman just swimming along, not yet seeing the shark, she represents the native peoples. Oh, what a sad story this is. What a sad story history is, isn't it? Jaws.
Okay, so as a result of this exploration and early conquest, we developed new trading patterns. The first of which is called the Columbian Exchange. And the Columbian Exchange is an exchange of food, disease, and people. And it's a biological exchange. Okay, and so this exchange is facilitated by European drive for, again, converting people to Christianity, wealth, all the aspects of Jaws. And so what's important to know, and is often on the AP test, is what goods are exchanged from where. So you have a little image of a map. And it's fun to note that potatoes, which are the crop that Ireland survives on during their famine, weren't even in Ireland prior to the 1500s. Other examples of this are tomatoes. Think of Italian food and pasta sauce and how that was not part of Italian culture prior to this exchange. From Europe, Asia, and Africa to the Americas, we have sugar, which becomes one of the major crops grown in the Americas, wheat, which is a major source of food for us today and ongoing, and disease, which we will get to the effects of this. But diseases are traded both ways, but the devastation is much stronger coming from Europe to the Americas and the impact on the Americas. So take a moment, you have a chart here, and you need to go through some of the causes of what is being exchanged, the event, and the effects. And you should use your reading, but I'll give you a hint. One is smallpox. Another, you could come up with any of the foods that are listed. And here we go, we zoomed in on the map that's in your notes so you can have a better idea in order to answer this question. All right, so the negative effects of the Columbian Exchange, here we go. Causes, Europeans increased their maritime power, Europeans' explorations reached the Americas, and indigenous populations had no natural immunities to disease. So remember, whether directly contacting one another, Europeans are trading long distance with the Middle East, with Asia, and same with Africa. And so these people have all had a chance to be exposed to the different diseases. Think of the spread of the plague. And then we get to the Americas, who have never had any contact with any of these diseases. And the effects are devastating. So the central event is that Afro-Eurasian diseases kill more than half of the native populations in North and South America. Populations decline almost 80% in the Americas because of the diseases from Africa and Asia. And so that is a key turning point in European, in life in the Americas because of the European impact. And the effects are that it's a major blow to the strength of American civilizations because, again, their population has declined. Also, Europeans begin their own population of their citizens and slaves. And so Europeans start to what we could call And as you can see here, a graph depicting the population loss that we discussed in the previous slide. I apologize, the previous slide got cut off. You may want to pause, go back a sec, and get those last few effects. But as you can see here, the years shows from 1500, which is just after the arrival of Columbus in the Indies, in the Caribbean, until 1620. And we see that the population of Native Americans at the beginning, around 1520, is 22 million. And then in under 100 years, the population declines to about 1 to 2 million. So there is massive population loss of the people of the Americas. And we're going to talk about the variety of factors and reasons why, but one is diseases, which we already mentioned. Another is enslavement, and the third is warfare. Those natives who resist European conquest are facing guns when they have bows and arrows, and so there is a great deal of population loss that way as well. On a more positive note, there were some positive impacts of the Columbian Exchange, the main impact of which they all have to do with food. So our causes are that Europeans increased their maritime power. Again, maritime has to do with the ocean. and seafaring power. 2, European explorations reached the Americas. 3, climate and soil in Americas provide staple foods like corn and potatoes. So staple foods are those foods that provide a great deal of calories and can grow in large numbers. So they're not necessarily the most nutritious, but they are a good base. And these staple foods, corn and potatoes, are able to be grown in areas of Europe and Asia where other staples like rice, say, or wheat aren't growing as well. So we talked earlier about Greece and Rome not being able to grow much wheat. Corn does much better in that soil. And so this spread of corn and potatoes as a staple food throughout the world increases populations worldwide. And so our central event is that New World crops spread throughout Europe, Asia, and Africa by Western merchants. So cuisines across the world start to shift and change, and we see Italians integrating pasta sauce or tomato sauce into their food. And the effect happens opposite as well. If you think about Mexican food and a key staple being rice, that rice comes from Asia, which it would never have gotten there without the Columbian Exchange. So the effects. In some places, population increased for the reasons mentioned above and the spread of different foods. 2, overall health of people began to improve with a more varied diet. We are talking about people other than the Native Americans. And 30% of food consumed today comes from the Americas. So the discovery of the foods in the Americas greatly increases the world food supply.
And we're back. So let's talk about these Europeans who seem so powerful, so great at trade, so great at transport across oceans, and yet they did not manage to overtake the Indian Ocean trade, which still was dominated by Middle Easterners and Asian merchants. And they did, however, dominate ocean trade, particularly the Atlantic, but also the Pacific, and let's not forget the Mediterranean Sea in Europe, Africa, in the Middle East. Meanwhile, they didn't conquer the Europeans, that is, didn't conquer most of Africa. In fact, just a few parts of southern Africa were conquered by Portuguese, and even then it was more of an economic rather than full-on ownership of land position. And you'll notice when we get to the other map that very little inland areas were taken over through this sea exploration. Only North America do you have. So let's take a look at the land. So compare this map to the map that you created just a few slides ago. Notice that the British dominate in areas where English is still the predominant language. Obviously, the 13 colonies in North America and then Canada. New France, you can see all the way up into Quebec, where French is still the primary language, and then down into Louisiana, where a pidgin language, a combo language of English and French, forms the one of the vernacular languages of Louisiana even to this day. Spanish throughout Mexico, Central America, South America, because the Spanish conquered these areas, and Spanish remains, of course, the main language. There is just a hint, a little smattering of Dutch by Guyana in South America, and then Brazil is, as we mentioned earlier, Portuguese as a result of that papal demarcation. If we look at Africa, as I mentioned just last slide, the Portuguese have some areas in kind of southern Africa, both in the west in Angola and the east by Mozambique, for example. The Dutch maintain the Cape of Good Hope, which figures for a few hundred years all the way into apartheid in South Africa, and the Dutch-based language of Afrikaans. And then the Dutch also maintain areas of Southeast Asia. If you look at the archipelagos just above Australia, you'll notice the Dutch influence. Quite a bit of control throughout the world, but certainly doesn't own the entire world at this point. Now, they do compete quite a bit between each other, between European nations. The 3 European nations that pulled the most profit from trade are, as you might imagine, the Spanish. Just look at their land holdings. The British with their companies, tea companies, spice companies, trading companies, and then also the Dutch companies, which maintain profits through trade, through mercantilism. This is what allows Europe to maintain dominance in the world at this time. This idea that exporting goods and maintaining gold and silver quantities will allow you to become a rich country, and it works wonders, at least for a good time. Now on, tag your it to Miss Cassidy.
All right, so mercantilism is an idea that will not go away. You will discuss the mercantilist wars in AP Euro or non-AP Euro, but it's inevitable, so remember it, and we'll be talking about it next unit as well. It's a common theme. So there are a few rules to mercantilism, the first of which is that nations should not buy or import goods from outside their own empire. The idea is that the British want to buy goods from other British, and the Dutch want to buy goods from other Dutch. When they're buying goods from outside their empire, they're giving money to other empires, which they don't want to do. 2, nations should export or sell their own goods to as many places as possible outside their country. So this means the British want to sell their goods to France and Spain and colonies as well. They don't just sell them within Europe, they sell them outside of Europe to the places they conquer. And that way you are taking money from other countries or regions and bringing it into your empire. 3rd, don't let your colony manufacture anything, and this is going to become an ongoing topic that we discuss, and also arguably the cause of a lot of inequality that exists still today across the globe. And so manufacture again means to take raw materials and produce them into finished goods. And the idea why your colony should not manufacture, because you want your colonies to buy manufactured goods from you. You want them to be dependent upon you. A colony that can manufacture can become independent, and that is not effective. 4, you want to hold on to your silver and gold, because this is what makes you rich and strong. So which European country is doing a good job of this? Is not doing a good job of this, sorry. You should think in your head, ding, 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 Iberian Peninsula. Portugal especially is one example. And think about how this affects the balance of trade. And we'll go more into that in the next slide. So here is a picture that you should draw, but the idea is that the mother country, which would be the nations in Europe who are conquering the other countries, have a treasury of gold and silver that they're stockpiling up. And their goal is to export more and import less. Pardon me. And that way they are making more money than they are spending. And the idea with the colonial relationship is that you want to get raw materials from the colonies, like gold, silver, fur, lumber, foodstuffs. And we're talking raw gold and raw silver from mines directly, not made into any jewelry or any coins, etc. Then they go to the mother country and go to factories, are manufactured into something useful. So we'll look at a cotton plant, but no one would want to wear a cotton plant. In Europe is where it goes through the process of being made into cloth. And it's that cloth that gets sent back to the colonies and charged a much higher price. So those raw materials can be made into something, but on their own are not very valuable. So the mother country receives them for a low price, manufactures them into something more valuable, and sells them back to the colonies at a much higher price. And the colonies have no choice because they have no other way to get these manufactured goods. Remember, they are not allowed to manufacture themselves. And so this is the system that keeps Europe very rich.
So, mercantilism continued. As these European nations get raw materials from other colonies, here's an example of a cotton plant that you would not wear, as Miss Cassidy noted. They get turned into manufactured goods. This is a place where the cotton would be woven into cloth that you can actually wear, and then you sell those goods, as in these towels, for example, and the mother country takes those finished products and sells them back to their own colony. So get the raw materials from the colonies, bring them to manufacture them in the mother country, and then sell them back to the colonies when they're processed into higher value items that are usable at a much higher price. So colonies are known as dependents. Why? Well, in the United States legal system and tax system, we have dependents as in families, little kids. Colonies are the children, in a sense, treated as the children of the mother countries, the Englands and Spains of the world, for example. Some people in the colonies definitely get wealth off of the world economy. Think about the business people who are running these private companies like the Dutch East India Company, for example, throughout the world. So even in the colonies, people can profit, but they have to find leverage to figure out where in the market they can do it. The people who are who are extracting the raw materials, who are running that system, and then shipping it over to the mother countries, that's where the money is, right? So in those actual companies. And coercive labor systems spread. Coercive labor, think slavery. If you can force somebody to do something for free, then you can make full profit off of whatever they do. If you have to pay them, then that cost is deducted. And so this is the economics of slavery, to think not only can I force people to make products, but I can also trade those human beings themselves. And so a system of forced labor starts that it eventually becomes a system of full African slavery. The slave trade continues, mostly after this period where first it's just extraction of material and then production by unpaid forced laborers, coercive labor then.
So if we think about how much of our globe is involved in this new world economy, the people who are involved are Latin America, which is the Caribbean islands or the West Indies, parts of South America, especially Brazil. Think Brazil because it's right along the Atlantic Ocean. It's a quick route back to Europe. And parts of Africa, only those involved in the slave trade, which again is those West African ports, so along the coast. The Europeans haven't yet dug into the inland areas. And then Europe, so England, France, Spain, Portugal, and the Netherlands. Then who's out, who's not quite interested in this world economy yet, is China and Japan. They want some Western advances, but they are fearful of too much Western influence and therefore resist too much trade with the West. Think about why. Think about Confucianism and what we've seen already with Japan, even resisting Chinese influence. The Muslim empires are not involved in this world economy to the extent of those who are in. So the Mughals in India are keeping to themselves, the Ottomans and the Safavids in the Middle East. Think back to that all of this exploration started because Europe wanted an efficient way to get to the Indies and to Asia without having to go by land through the Muslim empires. So a lot of this spawned from trying to circumvent the Muslim empires. And Russia. We'll talk more about Russia later, but they are currently minding their own business and conquered by the Mongols, so they are not part of this world economy yet. And majority of Africa, because most of Africa is inland, the majority of Africa has still not been brought into this world economy. And so here's a map of those who are in and those who are out, and you can sort of get a visual. And the world is divided.